research provides those insights of those things that your audience can do better or improve. And those can be the jumping off places to tell these spin-off stories.
You're listening to the Content 10x podcast, where it's all about content repurposing. I'm Amy Woods, and I'm here to help you maximize your content and find smart ways to get your message in front of more of the right people, whilst also saving time. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Content 10x podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, founder of Content 10x. And in this week's episode, we are talking all about repurposing research. Now, even if you've never conducted or commissioned an independent research study before, then please do listen to this podcast episode, because I can assure you that you may just realise that independent research is the missing piece of your content marketing puzzle. I have a fantastic guest joining me. Michelle Lynn is the founder of Mantis Research, where she helps content and community managers conduct surveys so they can learn about their audience and publish compelling original research findings. Prior to Mantis, Michelle was head of editorial at Content Marketing Institute, where she led the company's editorial strategy, helped build the 200,000 plus audience, and published hundreds of articles. She has been cited as a content marketing influencer and was named one of Folio's top women in media. In this episode, Michelle and I talk about how to turn a research report into lots of content, maybe even a year or more of content. We talk about different types of content you can repurpose research into and how to spot the opportunities. And Michelle shares the 4 R's of repurposing research and so much more. Well, let's jump in. Michelle, welcome to the Content 10x podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Amy.
No, it's great to have you. I've been really looking forward to this conversation, actually. Before we jump in and talk about, how you can get as much as you can from conducting surveys and research, could you just tell me a little bit more about what you do at Mantis Research? And also, I would love to know how you have got to where you are today as well. Like what was the path that led you to what you are doing today? That'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in the marketing space for a couple of decades. I started out as a product marketer. And then around 2008, I left my corporate job and I knew I wanted to freelance and do marketing and do writing. And I honestly didn't know what my path was going to be. But long story short, with a lot of serendipity and, meeting people along the way, I started doing content marketing to find clients for my business. And I realized how well that was working. And I realized, I would love to incorporate and help other clients do content marketing too. So I've been consulting for content marketing companies since, probably 2010-ish. And I started working with an organization called Content Marketing Institute, CMI, which some of your listeners might know about. So I was actually the first person their founder hired back in the day in 2010. So I was doing a lot of content marketing about content marketing for many years. So I left there in 2017. The company was sold. I adore the company, but I knew I just wanted to go out and just do something on my own again. And as I was thinking about what that transition could and should look like, I was getting kind of burnt out on general content marketing because I had talked about it and, written about it for so long. And I was looking for that gap in the marketplace of where do I think marketers can have a lot of success, but what kind of stuff do they just not know how to do yet? So I thought original research was a perfect fit, simply because, marketers get a lot of value from these projects, but they're difficult projects to know how to do if you haven't done them. So long story short, Mantis Research was started as a way to not only help clients with their survey-based original research projects like these trends reports and so forth, but we also teach marketers how to do this if they want to do these kinds of survey-based research on their own too.
Cool. So you're either doing it for them or, helping them to understand the best practices and best way to do it themselves.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Because I feel like a lot of marketers want to know how to do this, but it's tough unless you've been through that process.
It's funny because I did a podcast episode, a solo show, just me talking into the microphone not that long ago. And it was about research and, research reports and things like that, and how you should be looking at ways to repurpose them. And then it was funny because it was either the same week or thereabouts or that I saw this LinkedIn post from you. And I'm just going to read it out now. So too often marketers publish their findings and then move on to the next project or piece of content. My suggestion, keep a running list of spin-off stories you can tell from your data as you are doing your initial analysis. I did this for a client project I was working on this week, and I had a quick list of more than 20 editorial ideas related to their survey. So your initial goal isn't to come up with a formal plan, but rather you want to jot down thoughts on what you are learning from the research. So there was more, but we can talk about them more. But I just saw that and I thought this is absolutely brilliant, because I was sharing my thoughts and ideas, but then to hear you say that and look at what you do, and just thought I need to bring you onto the podcast and have a conversation about this. You are looking for all these different spin-off stories from the key findings in the research. What kind of things should you look for to spot these spin-off stories?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like I mentioned that LinkedIn post, I feel like I look both for, what is the content idea, and then what is the actual format that we can use to publish this. So if we're talking specifically about the content idea, as I'm walking through all of the data and analyzing the findings, I might find something like, only 40% of marketers are doing XYZ. Well, where I realize there's a big gap in the marketplace, and there's an opportunity for marketers to do more if they were to do this particular thing. And I can certainly share specific examples if that's helpful, but it's looking for those places where your research provides those insights of those things that your audience can do better or improve. And those can be the jumping off places to tell these spin-off stories.
And do you usually, from a workflow perspective, when you've conducted the survey and then you're looking at the data and drawing those insights in order to produce an insightful report based on the survey, have you already kind of thought in advance, even at the planning stage, of the questions that you'll ask and the insights you want to get, the kind of content you then want to produce from it? So does it feed in right at that early stage?
Yeah, I actually think about that storyline from the strategy perspective. So before we even get started, I think about, I call these inventory stats versus story stats. So your inventory stats are these state of the state, like this is how much people are spending, or they're going to be spending more, and like these they're useful stats if you want people to link to you, but there's not a whole lot you can do with them. But story stats are those things that, as their name implies, can actually help you provide insights and tell stories. So for instance, story stats would be something like data that would reveal an opportunity or a gap of what you're doing. Or you could also find stats that you could ask two different questions. So this was an example from a study I did with Typeset, and we found this data. I can't remember the specific numbers, but let's say we found that 60% of business owners wanted to write more. They wanted to produce more content, but only 40% wanted to actually spend more. So you kind of find those disconnects in the story. Those are really interesting ways to tell stories. And there's a lot of different types of these story stats that you can plan for, and you never know what the data is going to reveal. But if you plan the questions so that you can get these stories at the end, that's the best place to actually start.
Yeah. And I guess you need to look at the findings with, as you said, quite a journalistic eye, don't you? And spot the story that can come from it, in the same way that journalists are looking at news and seeing, right, well, this is some information, but how do we turn it into a compelling story that people? So it's having that eye, isn't it? Which I guess, is something that must come the more you do it. It's a learned thing to learn how to do that. And you mentioned it may be that you uncover a gap. So there's something that you see people should be doing, so you can create some stories around that. And I know in the post you said pick out data points that are surprising? Or you also said, like, is there something people are planning to do in the coming year that you could offer advice on for that? So again, is that something that when you are planning the research, if you've done some analysis already into your audience and you know there's a really hot topic, get as much information as you can on that in order to get the insights to offer advice on that particular area?
Yes, I mean, I think you definitely have to plan from the beginning. And then as you're looking through those findings, I find it's really helpful just to jot down all of the different story ideas that you're thinking about as you're producing. So what I do is I put together all of the data, and then I keep a running list of all of those stories. And then when I put together the findings, oftentimes you can't fit every little interesting nugget of data in every single story that you're finding. They don't all fit into that report. I kind of call it pinball head. As your readers reading it, they would their mindset would have to shift too many times. So I typically recommend that the report have just one through line story through it. And then all of these others, like jump off stories, you can use for other purposes. And I think it feels nice that you keep that list, so you feel like all of these good nuggets of stories and data won't get lost, and you don't feel like you have to jam them all into that one place. So everything that you produce is just more streamlined and clearer and so forth.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Not everything makes the report, but there's some great value and a different way to share it with the world. In terms of the how, so when you're deciding, right, so that could be a LinkedIn post, that could be a blog post, that could be an infographic. What do you recommend in terms of that the how? We've got the story, but now the how of getting it into the world.
Yes, I actually just wrote about this in a recent in one of my recent newsletters. I'm trying to put together a better framework for how people can repurpose research, because I feel like it feels so overwhelming. It seems easy to say, let's just repurpose this because there's so many things there, but the actual doing of it can feel hard. So what I talk about is the 4 R's of repurposing research. And they kind of run from the easiest to do to the more complicated, but you can kind of take any of these 4 paths to get more life out of your research. So do you want to walk through each?
Yeah, I'd love to. Piece? Yeah, the 4 R's of repurposing research. I love it. I'm really intrigued.
Yeah, so I this is something I came up with probably about 2 weeks ago, but it's still very much a work in progress, but I think it helps people think about what they can do. So the first R is for reuse. So like we talked about, not everything is going to make it into your findings, into that initial report, but you are going to have a ton of great data, a ton of great stories in those initial findings. So I recommend that people pull out all of those different interesting data points or interesting stats and stories and keep a running list of those. And then you can easily reuse all of those things on any social network that you're on. You can use them, within sales presentations and so forth. So you can create social graphics, you can do a LinkedIn post, you can do anything that you want that just pulls out these really interesting data points that you've already published. So that is a pretty easy lift. But I definitely wouldn't stop there. The next R is for reflect. So you can reflect on the data within, social media and so forth. And this personally is my favorite way to repurpose and to reuse research. So, for instance, like let's say you have a really interesting stat that you found. So I did this study on thought leadership with SurveyMonkey and Orbit Media a couple years ago. And one of the stats that we found that about we asked the question, is the quality of thought leadership impacted if it's ghostwritten? And we found about half the people said yes, half the people said no. So it was a really great conversation to say, okay, this is what we did. This is what we found. Hey, what does everyone think? And so that led to some really good conversation. People brought up some really good points that led to more LinkedIn posts. And not all of those LinkedIn posts directly related back to a data point that I had in that research, but it related back to that first point. And it was just a wonderful conversation. And it was a wonderful way to think about that data and actually use it in a meaningful way so that it means something. And then you can use what you've learned in those conversations, if you do an annual study, to then take that annual study to the next level. So I think that's a really fun way to repurpose your data. The third R is about revealing solutions. So this is, like we talked about, a lot of times your research is going to find those gaps or those opportunities. So when I worked for CMI, our annual research always showed that people who had a documented content marketing strategy were more successful. I mean, it's obvious, but this is something we've been talking about for probably 10 years at this point. But what we did back in the day is we put together a guide on how to create a documented content marketing strategy. So that data point spurred this piece of content that said, hey, we know marketers need to be able to do this. Here's how to do it. And then in our research, we could point to that guide, and then that guide can point to the research. So that's more net new content, but it's a great way to repurpose that data in a way, again, that makes those insights useful. And then the last R, as I talk about, is reimagining your data. So chances are when you do a research study, you're going to be, again, looking at one throughput, like one storyline for your findings. You're going to have all of this other data that you don't share. So it could be like how different segments handle something, men versus women, or B2B versus B2C, or, there's countless different ways to look at your data segments. But what kind of, how can you share this unpublished data with your audience in some different ways? And think about just all the unpublished data that you have and bring that out into the marketplace. And of course, always point back to those main findings and have the findings point back to that. So I think that's another fun way to get more life out of this one research project.
So yeah, it's fascinating. There's just so much that you can do, and it really justifies the investment in conducting the research in the first place. If you can just go on and share such highly valuable content in all of those different ways through repurposing, doesn't it? Hey, just a little break from this week's episode to let you know about becoming a Content 10x Insider. If you want more content repurposing tips and advice, then why not join hundreds of business owners, marketers, and content creators who get them delivered straight to their inbox once a week by subscribing to the Content 10x newsletter. As well as tips and advice, you get industry updates, inspiring stories, exclusive content, offers, and more. You can subscribe at content10x.com/newsletter, and there's a link in the show notes too. Okay, back to this week's episode. I love that, and I love the different approaches. It got me thinking about, obviously, there's no simple answer to the what. So is that a blog post? Is it a LinkedIn post? Is it an infographic or whatever? Because that depends on the audience, doesn't it? And well, where are your ideal clients? And are we talking about content that you want to develop for social or for your website or for SEO? So there's a bigger consideration there of the intention, isn't there, in the audience? But it just got me thinking how, for example, even a podcast. So we've been talking about posts and LinkedIn content, tweets, things like that would be really good, graphics and stuff. But, and I'm sure many of the research reports and surveys that you've done could probably turn into a podcast season, for example, couldn't they, where you bring experts on to discuss these insights and data findings, or you do solo thought leadership where you run through significant points, insights, etc. Would you agree, and have you seen that in action, like podcasts just purely based off an extensive piece of research?
Yes, I mean, I think to your point about thinking about the formats, it's like a three-dimensional puzzle that you need to put together. Yeah. And I always suggest that people focus on where they already are. If they're good at blog writing, if they're good at webinars, whatever those things are, focus there. And I love your idea about doing a podcast series on a research report. I haven't seen it, but I would love to see it. And I think it could be interesting to take different data points that you explore, like one per week. Or I've done video roundtables. You could use a similar format for podcasts where we look at one question and we have a discussion with all of these experts. You could even do one long conversation and then break that into your series for the season. But I think there's a lot of different ways that a lot of different formats that you can use to get this research out there.
Yeah, exactly. Some people want to, I mean, I always say this, but some people just want to listen to these things. Some people want to watch some video content on it. Some people will just indulge in reading every piece of content you write about on your site. Some people don't like long form, but will look at all the tweets and LinkedIn posts you do. So it's about catering to the different preferred learning styles and content consumer behavior, isn't it, I guess? Because I was thinking of like I said, like it would be, you could have a podcast season based on research and you would find enough ways to break it down for 10 episodes or something. But I was also thinking about webinars, because in the podcast episode where I, briefly touched on, this is way more in depth and insightful, but I briefly touched on repurposing research. It was research reports and white papers I was talking about. And I gave the example of the Infinite Dial report by Edison Research and Triton Digital, and how I really like the way that Tom Webster and I can't remember the name of his colleague, but Tom and his colleague jump on, and they always do a webinar to talk about the findings of the Infinite Dial. And I was at a podcast conference one year when they were running the webinar, and there was a bit of an in-person watch party. Loads of people said, let's get some drinks, let's get some food, and let's hire a room in the hotel or whatever it was. And everyone gathered together and watched basically the findings of a highly regarded and respected survey that's done every year. It really interested me because some people probably will never actually open that report and look at the finer details, but they just love to hear the people involved and kind of just talk through it all. So running a webinar to release and almost have a launch party in a way of the release of the report. But you could also, I suppose, in the podcast idea, you could run a series of webinars actually, couldn't you? In the same way, you could be some research findings could be great for having a panel discussion about it, or some solo, or just sharing some slides and some data in a webinar. But that's something else that you could do, isn't it? Like a webinar series.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Because it's funny, because I think Tom and his team do a great job on that project as well, and I've used that as examples I've shared in the past. And I think with the webinar, I love the idea of a watch party, but I think webinars also work well for people who are trying to balance getting their research out to as many people as possible. But webinars, I mean, people typically are fine giving all of their information. So they're a really great source to bring people into the funnel and to nurture them and so forth. So I like to think about not only, what are you good at? What does your data lend itself to, but what are your goals? And I think webinars are great, for getting out those leads or getting, bringing leads into the system. But and just as one more example, I worked with a client and we developed this model. So we had, long story short, it was basically their table of contents. We looked at 4 different areas of digital experience. And so they created this model called ADAM. So A was for alignment, T was for technology, O was for outcome, and M was for mindset. And they had all this data in all of these different areas. And then they published these small webinars. And so they had one on alignment, one on outcome, one on technology, one on mindset. So if you structure your research well from the beginning, how you can get that content out there, it's almost kind of obvious. You can just follow that same model. And they could have done that exact same thing with podcasts too. But look deep into each area of the research. It's a great way to repurpose it without feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah. I love that. Would it be fair to say that a really decent in-depth piece of research could be the content fuel for a 1-year content strategy for a business? Really, you wouldn't be far-reaching to say that, would it? I think you probably could create a year strategy from one really good piece of research.
Absolutely. And I think you need, it needs to be in depth enough. And I think you need to have enough segments. You can't just do a 5-question survey. That's not going to get you there. But if you do a bigger benchmarking study where you have all of these different, 4 to 5 big categories, and you have all of these people and you have different survey questions that you can use to segment the data and look at the data in different ways, I think you absolutely can. I actually wrote a blog post. This was probably 2019-ish. And it was called How to Create a Year's Worth of Content from One Research Report. So
there you go.
I think it's a model that I think can work really, really well. And you just have to get smart on how you can do it and think about, like you said, all these different ways. But I think your opportunities are like limitless, as long as that data isn't too time specific. You know what I mean? If you were asking just about COVID at the beginning of COVID, that has some shelf life. But most of these studies are, have an annual life at the very least.
Yeah, I guess like we were just talking about with Edison Research, because they do that every year and they do lots of different reports, don't they? But the annual Infinite Dow report based on the US consumer behavior, because they do it every year, I guess maybe I'm not right here, but it must become just a very repeatable process for them. So the first time they did it, it would have been a lot of hard work and things like that. But then if it becomes a repeatable process that your audience look forward to and get excited about, but it just gets easier every year because you're doing it every year, then you're going to be spinning as much, if not more content each year, probably through a slightly more streamlined process if it's the same kind of thing rolled out. Would that be fair, or is it not quite?
I would say ish.
Yeah.
I would say, I think that the initial, because I work with clients on a lot of annual projects, and typically what we do is we probably keep, I would say 50 to 70% of the questions year over year. Sometimes if you run annual studies, you're going to see the same results every year, and that gets kind of boring. But obviously the beauty of annual studies is you can find those trends. So long story short, it is a little less upfront work, but you still have to, I wouldn't just put your program on repeat. I would get rid of some stuff that's not so useful. I would think about what you can ask, where you can find those new insights. And then what does take more time is the upfront process is a bit easier. The back end process is longer because you're not just looking at that year's data, you're looking at data year over year. So I spend a lot more time on the data analysis portion for annual reports and less upfront time. So
there's more to compare against.
I don't spend that less time. Like the process is easier because you know what you're doing. So that part's streamlined, but it's still work. It's just work in different ways.
Yeah. And I guess there is more insights as you start to have, like you said, year on year comparable data. Yeah. So makes sense. Yeah. Something else that is a real win is that when you are conducting some original research in your industry, as well as all the content that you can create and repurpose from it, you're more likely to be creating shareable content, aren't you? Because people in your industry are looking up the answer to how many, people have done this, or what's the percentage of that. And when you're the owner and the gatekeeper of that, find those findings, those graphics that you created or the blog posts that you shared and things like that, they must get shared and reused again and again by other companies and other people, right? It must be highly shareable when it's original research.
Absolutely. So whenever I start working, I know Andy Crestodina years ago, he called this find the stat. I think that's what he called it. And he's like, if you can be like the source of that particular stat and people are constantly linking to you, just like you said, Amy, that's a wonderful way to bring those backlinks and get results. Obviously, you just need to make sure that data lives on one page, because as you start to repurpose, these things live in all of these different places. So I always suggest to people to drive back to that one spot, so that one spot can get all of those backlinks, and all your hard work isn't, spread all out, and it's just harder to get, to rank and get domain authority for any one thing. But I think absolutely, and if you can ask from the beginning, like, what is that data that my prospects and my audience want to know about that we don't yet have, and you can find that answer. I think that's very, very powerful. But you just have to make sure, and this is going to sound obvious. I talk to a lot of people who want to do research in very crowded spaces. Some people don't always look to see what else is out there. They just assume they can make a space and a place for themselves with research. So always find that niche where those questions haven't been answered, and you're going to be a lot more successful.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Well, I've got two final questions for you, Michelle. The first one is, what, in your experience, is maybe one of the biggest mistakes that you see people make when they embark on an independent research project?
So I think that there's a lot of steps involved in a research project. And I completely understand limited budgets and so forth. The thing I would recommend that people get help with is getting the actual survey designed correctly, those survey questions, because I've talked to marketers several times. Unfortunately, those who have done research in-house, even those who've worked with other research partners, and they do all of this work to do this big survey, and they get the results back and they're like, oh, like this is kind of boring. Like I can't do anything with this. Or if you realize you've asked questions in a way that's unclear, or any of those other things. So if you get your survey wrong from the get-go, the rest of the project and all of those repurposing opportunities just kind of, they're gone. So the biggest mistake is not spending enough time on that initial survey design, just throwing out some questions out there and hoping for the best. I mean, you really need to be thoughtful about setting that up well so that you can get the best results long term.
Yeah, makes complete sense. And lastly, I just wondered with regards to the targeting and the audience. So obviously a really important thing is the right people answering the questions for the data to be as insightful as it can be. How do you do that? So how do you really make sure that you're asking the right people, and how do you find them and reach out to them?
In a very long story short kind of way, you either have two options, effectively, kind of three. You can either they have a lot of panel companies out there, and these are companies that you can work with to get these survey responses based on the criteria that you set up. So if you want to work with a panel company, these work well in some instances, but you just need to make sure that the screening questions you ask truly are going to find the right person, and they're going to disqualify the people that aren't right. And you also have to realize that panels are just broad segments of the population. And even if they might be qualified by their title or whatever, they might not have that knowledge that you want. So again, you need to get very specific with your screeners, and you need to have a very easy to answer survey so that, people can answer them thoughtfully. The other option you have, which is my preferred method for B2B surveys, if you're going after marketers or IT pros, is to either tap into your own list and or to partner with someone else so you can get insights. Long story short, there can be some bias in that list, but depending on the type of questions you're asking, like I would never do a survey to like say, hey, let's prove that people are actually doing this or using this. But if you're looking at a topic from a more curiosity, holistic perspective, it makes a lot of sense to tap into your own audience, because you can from my experience, people answer a lot more thoughtfully. You can ask a lot deeper questions. They'll spend more time and so forth. So if you don't have a big enough list, you can always partner with someone who does, if you can find that right partner. And that can be a great way to find those people too.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you. Lots of great tips there. And like you said, I guess that's a big subject to cover. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's just been such a wonderful conversation. I'm sure everyone listening along has taken so much from this. I will obviously add links to the things that we talked about, the articles that you mentioned and all of that. Is there anywhere you'd like people to go to connect with you, or any next step that you would like people to take?
Yeah, so you can absolutely, I guess there's three ways. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love to share information and meet new people on LinkedIn. You could also go to my website if you want to subscribe to my email newsletter that's published once a month. And the other thing that I just started doing in collaboration with Aaron Balsa is we do a virtual monthly meetup. It's a 30-minute meetup called Research Power Half Hour, where we bring in different people, and we're just trying to bring together people who are doing this type of work so we can all learn from each other. So I was very surprised how many people there were actually doing this work. And our next month's topic in April is actually about repurposing. So you can certainly, join those as well to learn from others.
That sounds brilliant. Thank you. Well, I'll make sure we link to everything so people can have one-click access to everything you just mentioned. So yeah, thank you so much. What a fantastic conversation. So it's been great to have you on.
Thanks so much, Amy. This was fun.
Okay, Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that discussion and thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoy the Content 10x podcast, then why not hit that subscribe button on your podcast listening app of choice so that you can get updated when new episodes are released. And I'd really, really appreciate it if you could leave a review as well. That really makes a difference for the podcast. Also, please do get a copy of my book, Content 10x, More Content, Less Time, Maximum Results. It is the ultimate guide to repurposing every type of content, and it's available on Amazon in Kindle and paperback and also in audiobook as well. And you can head to content10x.com/book to find all the other places that you can get a copy of my book. And if you would like us to do your content repurposing for you, then we offer a fully end-to-end done-for-you content repurposing service. This is for podcasters and video content creators. We have our Podcast 10x, Video 10x, and also our specific LinkedIn 10x service, helping you to become the leading authority in your industry on LinkedIn. You can find out so much more about our services on our website. And also, please do give me a follow on the social media platforms. I share lots and lots of tips and advice on social media about content repurposing. I'm at Content 10x on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and if you try content10x.com/LinkedIn, you'll find my LinkedIn profile over there as well. All that's left to say is thank you so much for listening to this week's episode, and I'll catch you in the next one.